It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just a quiet escape from the noise of the city. My girlfriend and I had both been feeling burned out from work and needed time away from our routines. We chose a private cabin in upstate New York, secluded, surrounded by trees, with a big wooden deck and a fire pit out back. The listing showed cozy furniture, a king-sized bed, a little kitchen, and huge windows that looked out over a patch of forest. It had great reviews. People described it as private, charming, perfect for couples. We arrived late on a Friday evening. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, and the last bits of light were fading when we pulled into the gravel driveway. The cabin was cute, exactly like the pictures. The outside lights were already on. There was a keypad lock on the front door, and the code worked without any trouble. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar. Clean floors, rustic furniture, soft lighting, and thick curtains. The host had even left a little welcome note and a couple of packets of instant cocoa on the counter. After unpacking, we spent that night cooking pasta, watching a movie on my laptop, and just enjoying the silence. It was cold, but the heating worked well. The only noises we heard were the wind moving through the trees outside and the occasional creak of the wooden walls adjusting to the temperature. The bedroom was small but nice. The bed was pushed up against the back wall with thick blankets, and there was a little dresser and a nightstand on each side. The ceiling was lower in there, and above the bed, centered on the ceiling, was a white smoke detector. I noticed it when I lay back and looked up. I didn't think much of it at the time. The next day, we explored the nearby town. We walked around, had lunch at a diner, and bought firewood from a roadside stand. When we got back to the cabin that afternoon, we made a fire outside and sat around drinking wine until the sun started going down. There were no other cabins or houses visible from the property. We hadn't seen another person since arriving. It really did feel like we were out in the middle of nowhere. That night, we went to bed a little after midnight. I plugged in my phone beside the bed and got under the blankets. I was facing the ceiling again, and that's when I noticed it. The smoke detector had a light, a tiny blue light. It was faint and small, not flashing constantly, but it blinked once every few seconds. I stared at it for a while. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was a reflection. I turned off my phone screen and waited in the dark. Blink. A soft little flash, like the LED on some electronic devices. It didn't belong on a regular smoke detector. Something about it made my stomach twist a little. I sat up and kept staring. I'd seen articles online about hidden cameras in ARMs before. A few times, I'd even joked with friends about it. But this felt different now that I was staring at a blinking light above my own bed. I didn't want to scare my girlfriend, so I quietly got out of bed and pulled a chair over from the corner of the room. I climbed up and looked closely. The plastic casing was dusty, and up close, I could see a tiny hole near the center, smaller than a pencil tip. And sure enough, inside the hole was a lens. A camera lens. I just froze. My whole body went cold. I couldn't stop thinking about the angle. The camera was pointed directly at the bed. There was no reason for a smoke detector to have a blinking light or a hole like that. It wasn't even wired into the ceiling properly. It looked like someone had hollowed out the inside and rigged something inside it. I felt sick. I got down, tried to stay calm, and quietly unplugged my phone again. I woke my girlfriend without explaining anything. I just said we had to leave right away. She asked what was wrong, but I told her I'd explain in the car. We packed our bags in minutes, tossed everything into the trunk, and were driving away in under 10. Once we were on the road, I told her. I explained everything. At first, she didn't believe me. She thought maybe I was overreacting. But then I showed her the photo I took with my phone before we left. A close-up of the blinking blue light and the little lens inside the detector. She went quiet. We drove the rest of the way in silence, checking into a cheap roadside motel just outside town. The next morning, I called the host. I told him what I found and asked him to explain. He denied it flat out. Said it was just a normal smoke detector. Said maybe I had a faulty phone flashlight or imagined it. His tone changed when I said I had photos, but he still kept denying it. I filed a report with Airbnb immediately. I sent them the photos, described everything in detail. I also called the local police department and made a report. They didn't seem too surprised. The officer I spoke to said they'd had a few reports like that before. Airbnb eventually refunded us the full amount for the stay. They told us they'd investigate the host and take the listing down for review. The listing was gone from the site a few days later. We never saw it pop up again, not under the same name or address. But here's the part that still gets to me. No one could tell us if the camera was streaming or just recording. No one knew if it had a memory card inside or if it was connected to a remote feed. The police said they'd look into it, but I never heard back from them. Airbnb wouldn't give any more details for privacy reasons. I kept checking online, trying to see if anyone else had posted about that cabin or the host. Nothing ever turned up. Weeks went by, then months. Every so often, I'd remember that blinking light, the way it flashed slowly like it was breathing. I started thinking about all the things we did while we were there. Every moment in that bedroom. The things we said, the way we acted when we thought we were alone. It all felt tainted now, like someone had been watching us through a peephole the entire time. I replaced every smoke detector in my apartment. I stopped booking Airbnbs for a long time. Even now, whenever I walk into a hotel or vacation rental, I scan the ceilings, the shelves, the air vents. I look for anything out of place, any tiny blinking light. I even bought a camera detector off Amazon just to carry with me when I travel. Some people I've told about this say, I'm lucky I found it when I did, that it could have been worse. But I don't feel lucky. I feel violated. Someone put that camera there. Someone either watched us or recorded us. And whoever that was, they still have the footage. Somewhere. Maybe saved on a hard drive. Maybe on a server. Maybe shared. I'll never know. I've come to accept that I'll probably never get closure. The refund didn't fix anything. The apology from Airbnb felt empty. No one ever got held accountable, as far as I know. The host just vanished. But what still haunts me isn't the camera itself. It's the fact that I almost didn't notice. If that light hadn't blinked at just the right angle when I was plugging in my phone, I might have never known. We would have stayed there another night, maybe more. Now I pay attention to everything, to every little sound, and every little light, and I never forget to look up. I booked the Airbnb because it looked beautiful in the photos, an old Victorian-style house in a quiet part of Maine, tucked just a little ways off the coast. The exterior was a pale bluish gray with white trim, and the porch wrapped around the front like a scene from a postcard. It looked peaceful, isolated, but peaceful. I wanted something different from the usual hotel stays, something quiet, with a bit of history. The listing said it had been standing since the 1800s, lovingly restored, with antique furniture and original hardwood floors. I thought it sounded perfect. I arrived a little before sunset. The drive up had been uneventful, two-lane roads through forest and the occasional field, all leading into smaller and smaller towns until finally the GPS told me to turn down a gravel path lined with trees on both sides. The house was at the very end of it. There were no neighbors nearby, just trees and that big, quiet sky. I parked in the gravel area beside the house. There was a little metal lockbox on the front door with the key inside. I punched in the code the host had sent me and let myself in. The door creaked loudly when it opened, and I remember thinking the sound actually fit the place. It smelled faintly like old wood and something herbal, lavender maybe, or a cleaning product meant to smell like it. Inside, the house was exactly as pictured. The living room had a plush, faded couch and two big wingback chairs arranged near the fireplace. The floorboards were wide and dark, and they creaked whenever I moved. Every room had old furniture, heavy dressers, old lamps with fringe, lace curtains. The kitchen was large, with a big wooden table in the center and a gas stove with black iron grates. Everything was neat, but not in a sterile, hotel-like way. It felt like someone's grandmother had lived there until recently. The host had left a printed welcome note on the kitchen counter, along with the Wi-Fi password and a number to call in case of emergencies. I set my bag down in the bedroom at the end of the hall, and I came back to heat up some leftover pasta I'd brought with me. While the food was warming on the stove, I noticed a thick guest book lying on the kitchen counter. It was one of those hardcover spiral-bound notebooks, like the kind you'd see at a wedding. The front cover said, "Welcome," in gold letters. Out of curiosity, I started flipping through it. Most of the entries were polite and generic, people thanking the host for a lovely stay, complimenting the decorations, mentioning how peaceful it was. A few people had scribbled little doodles or smiley faces next to their comments. It was all standard Airbnb stuff. But near the back, there was an entry that immediately stood out. It was written in all capital letters, as if someone had rushed it. "Do not stay here alone. The owner comes back at night." That was it. No name, no date, just that one sentence written heavily in black ink. The pen had pressed so hard into the paper that it had almost torn through. I stared at it for a long moment. I wasn't sure how to react. My first instinct was to laugh it off, probably just someone trying to be funny. People love to make haunted house jokes, especially in a place like this. But something about the handwriting unsettled me. There was no smiley face, no joking tone. It looked rushed, like someone had written it quickly and deliberately. It didn't feel like a joke. Still, I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself it was nothing and ate my dinner. Afterward, I took a shower in the clawfoot tub and settled into bed with a book. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wood. I left the lamp on while I read, not really feeling sleepy. Around midnight, I finally turned off the light. The room was completely dark. There were no street lights outside, no cars passing by. The only light came from the moon, faintly glowing through the lace curtains. I lay there listening to the silence. Then, a little after 1 a.m, I heard the front door unlock. It wasn't a subtle sound. The deadbolt made a loud click, followed by the squeak of the doorknob turning. Then the door opened with a long creak. I froze. My bedroom was down the hallway, but I could hear the sound clearly. Someone was inside the house. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. The door clicked shut again. Then came slow footsteps on the wooden floor. Steady. Measured. They walked across the living room, paused, then kept going, past the kitchen, then toward the hallway. They didn't rush. It was like they knew where they were going. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a weapon, and there was no lock on the bedroom door. I reached for my phone as quietly as I could and turned the screen brightness all the way down. I didn't want even a flicker of light to show. I opened the camera app and listened. The footsteps had stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, for what felt like forever. I never heard the person leave. No footsteps going back to the door. No closing click. Just silence. At some point, I must have dozed off from exhaustion or fear. When I woke up, it was early morning. Pale blue light was coming through the curtains. Birds were chirping outside. I got up slowly and walked into the living room. The front door was locked again. The chain was in place. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing, but the wooden chair that had been tucked neatly under the kitchen table the night before was now pulled out, facing slightly toward the hallway. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed my bag in less than 5 minutes and left. I didn't even stop to brush my teeth. I drove straight into town and found a coffee shop just to get out of the car and be around people. I messaged the host through the app and told them I was checking out a day early due to a change in plans. I asked if anyone else had access to the house or had come by the previous night. The host read the message but never replied. That was 3 months ago. I never got a follow-up. I left a neutral review, just enough not to raise suspicion, but not glowing either. I didn't mention the guest book entry. I didn't mention the footsteps or the unlocked door. I didn't want to deal with it, but I still think about it sometimes. I think about how calm those footsteps sounded, how deliberate. I think about that warning written in capital letters. I've stayed in dozens of Airbnbs over the years. Some good, some weird, most forgettable. But this one still stays with me. Not because of anything I saw, but because of what I didn't. Because I was completely alone, or at least I thought I was. I rented a guest suite in Florida that was attached to the side of a larger house. It wasn't exactly my first choice, but it had decent reviews, a private entrance, and the location worked for where I needed to be for a few days. The listing showed a small one-bedroom space with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a private door that opened out to the driveway. The host lived in the main house, and the unit was basically a separate part with a dividing wall. It looked clean in the pictures, and the price was good, so I booked it. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was still bright, humid, and heavy, like it gets in Florida even in early spring. The host had left the key in a lockbox beside the door. I parked in the little patch of driveway on the side, pulled my suitcase out of the trunk, and opened the door. The unit was small but comfortable. A little couch, a bed against the wall, a mini fridge, microwave, small sink. Enough for what I needed. The place was clean, smelled faintly like cleaning spray and linen. I took a shower, settled in, and spent the first night watching some shows on my laptop before falling asleep without much thought. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab something from my car. That's when I saw him. An older man, probably in his 60s, standing on the porch of the house next door. He didn't wave or smile. He just stared. Not a glance, not a quick look of curiosity. He stood there with a coffee mug in his hand, locked in on me like I had walked onto his property. I looked away, got what I needed from the car, and went back inside. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he was just one of those guys who doesn't like strangers around. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't loud. I wasn't leaving trash out or parking where I shouldn't. I figured he'd forget about me in a day or two. But he didn't. Every time I left or came back to the Airbnb, he was there, just standing, watching. Once he was trimming some bushes in his front yard, and I pulled into the driveway. He stopped cutting and just stared until I went inside. Another time, I saw his blinds shift as I stepped out. I'd catch him leaning slightly behind the side of his house, like he wanted to see without being seen, but never really trying that hard to hide it. It was unsettling. There was something in his eyes, something cold, like he wasn't just being nosy. He was watching for a reason. I started locking the door the second I came inside. I even pushed one of the kitchen chairs up against the doorknob at night, not because I really thought it would stop anything, but it made me feel a little better. About 4 nights in, I came back from a late dinner. It was around 9:45 p.m., already dark. I had driven to a seafood place by the beach, eaten alone, and taken a slow walk near the water before heading back. The neighborhood was quiet as I pulled into the driveway. The porch light was on, but something immediately felt wrong. The door to the unit, my door, was open. Not wide open, but slightly ajar. The way a door looks when it doesn't latch all the way, or when someone pulls it closed behind them but doesn't check it. I sat in my car with the engine running and stared at it. I knew I had closed it when I left. I always pulled on it to make sure it was locked, and I remembered hearing the latch catch when I left earlier. I didn't get out. I didn't go up and check. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, trying to calm my breathing. After a minute, I backed the car out of the driveway and parked down the street. I called the host. I told her what I saw. She sounded confused and said she hadn't gone into the unit, hadn't even been home most of the day. I told her I wasn't going back in, that I was going to stay at a hotel for the night. She said she understood. I drove 10 minutes to a chain hotel near the freeway, checked in, sat on the bed, and stared at the ceiling for a while. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside made me sit up and look at the door. I wasn't scared in the usual way. It wasn't like a movie. It was slower, heavier, more like a growing certainty that someone had touched my space, been where they shouldn't. The next morning, I went back around 8 a.m. The sun was up, and I figured if anything had been disturbed, I should see it in the daylight. When I pulled into the driveway, I scanned the neighbor's porch. He wasn't there. The door was now closed, which meant the host or someone else must have come by. I texted her, and she said she had gone in briefly after our call to check, but everything looked fine. She offered me a refund for the last few nights if I wanted to cancel early. I told her I was done, packed up my stuff, and left for good. I didn't expect to hear from her again, but a week later she emailed me. Said she felt like I should know something. She had a Ring camera mounted discreetly above the walkway between the main house and the guest suite, mostly for her own safety. She said that on the night I had left, the camera had recorded the neighbor. He had walked over to the door of the guest unit and tried the handle twice. First a quiet check, then a firmer tug. The door had been locked when I left, but apparently not enough to catch the bolt. After trying it, he stood there for a few seconds, then turned and walked back to his house. She sent me the video. I watched it in my email inbox, sitting at my kitchen table back home. There he was, in shorts and a t-shirt, looking like he was just taking a stroll, but clearly testing the door. Not knocking, not calling out, just checking if it would open. Asked if she had called the police. She had. They came and took a report, but they didn't press charges. Since he hadn't actually entered the unit or stolen anything, there wasn't much they could do. He claimed he was checking if the guest had left the door open and thought it might be unlocked by mistake. She said she had tried to talk to him after, but he just brushed it off and said she was overreacting. I kept the video, watched it a few more times before deleting it. Every time I saw the way he reached for the handle, the way he looked around before stepping away, it made my stomach tighten. It wasn't a mistake. He knew I was staying there. He was waiting until it looked like I was gone. Nothing else ever came of it. The host said she was planning to install more lights and maybe a second camera. I left a detailed review, not angry, just factual. I didn't want someone else walking into the same thing. Sometimes, it still hits me at night when I hear a creak in my apartment or notice my door isn't fully latched. I'll think about that man on the porch, about the way he stood there watching, and the way he reached for the handle like he was completely alone, like he'd done it before. This one still gives me chills, even though it happened a little over a year ago. I had flown into Los Angeles for a work trip, and instead of booking a hotel, I chose an Airbnb. It was a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, not far from Culver City. The place looked clean and well kept in the photos. The host had good reviews, nothing below 4 stars, and a lot of people mentioned how secure and quiet the building was. I didn't think twice. It was a decent price for the area and looked like a good place to crash for a few nights while I got my meetings out of the way. I arrived in the early evening, just after rush hour. The check-in was easy, key in a lockbox outside the main door. The building had 3 floors, and my unit was on the 2nd. As soon as I stepped inside, everything looked exactly like the photos. Modern, minimal, white walls, small gray couch, tiny kitchen off to the side. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable. What caught my eye right away was a small black camera mounted in the top corner of the living room, angled toward the entrance and part of the couch. It was the round, glossy kind, probably a Nest or something similar. There is a note on the shelf under the TV with a Wi-Fi password and a reminder. Camera is disabled during guest stays for your privacy. I remember pausing for a moment and looking up at it. It had a little LED ring around the lens, not lit up, but I still didn't feel right about it. I reached behind the shelf and found the cord that led to its power adapter. Without much thought, I unplugged it. The LED never turned on, but I just didn't want to take any chances. I'm not the most paranoid person, but I don't like the idea of being watched, especially in a space I'm paying to stay in. That first night was fine. I ordered some Thai food from a nearby spot and ate on the couch. Slept well. The next day, I had back-to-back meetings across town and didn't get back to the apartment until almost 8 p.m. I remember walking in and locking the door behind me. I turned on the light, dropped my keys on the little kitchen counter, and froze. The camera in the corner was plugged in again. I stood there for a few seconds just staring at it, trying to think if maybe I had forgotten and left it plugged in. But I hadn't. I clearly remembered bending down, finding the outlet, and pulling the plug out the night before. I even remember where I left the cord, tucked behind the shelf so it wouldn't dangle. Now it was hanging out again, cleanly looped like someone had gently placed it back. I went over to the plug just to be sure. It was firmly connected to the wall, and the camera had a slow blinking light, like it was in standby mode. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't asked anyone to come in. No cleaning was scheduled. No mention of it on the listing either. I felt weird. Not scared, exactly, more like watched. That kind of crawling discomfort that you feel in your stomach when something's wrong, but you can't prove it yet. I walked the apartment and checked everything. The windows were locked, The front door was still latched. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside while I was out. Someone had gone out of their way to plug that thing back in. I sat down on the couch and stared up at the little black eye in the corner. I started to feel uneasy, like every movement I made was being recorded. Every breath, every glance toward the camera. I grabbed my phone and messaged the host through the app. I kept it simple and polite. I said something like, "Hi, I noticed the camera in the living room was plugged in again. I had unplugged it when I arrived since the listing said it's disabled during stays. Can you confirm no one else has access to the unit?" It took maybe 10 minutes for the host to reply. The message was short. All it said was, "The camera has motion detection. Please don't tamper with the equipment." That was it.
No griting, no explanation.
Just that sentence. I reread the message 3 times. Motion detection? Disabled during stays? Why would it need motion detection if it wasn't active? And why was it plugged back in? The host didn't deny it had been reconnected, didn't apologize, just told me not to touch it. Something didn't sit right. I stood up and paced for a while. It wasn't just the camera. It was the silence of the apartment, the way the shadows moved in the corners when I passed the kitchen light, the smell that didn't quite belong, like someone else's cologne lingering faintly in the air, just enough to notice. I thought maybe I was overreacting, but my gut wouldn't let it go. I didn't want to spend another night there. I called a friend who lived in Santa Monica and asked if I could crash at his place. He said yes without even asking why. I started packing my stuff immediately. Every minute I stayed felt wrong. I moved fast but careful, checking drawers, the bathroom, my bags. I wanted to make sure nothing was missing or worse, tampered with. Before I left, I unplugged the camera again and took photos. One of the camera in the corner, one of the plug in the wall. I took a photo of the note about it being disabled during guest days too. Then I left. I didn't even bother turning off the lights. I just grabbed my bags, double-locked the door behind me, and walked out into the warm night. I sat in my rental car for a few minutes, parked on the side of the street, engine running. I watched the windows of the unit from across the road. No movement, no lights shifting. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like I needed to go. Like someone was watching from behind the blinds. I couldn't prove anything, but my body was on edge. I drove to my friend's place and stayed there for the rest of the trip. Filed a report with Airbnb that same night. I included the photos, screenshots of the messages, and explained everything that had happened. They refunded the rest of the stay after a few days, but they didn't tell me much else. Just a standard response about guest safety being important and that they'd investigate. I never got a clear answer on whether the camera had been recording, whether the host came in while I was out, whether I was being watched, or if someone was just messing with me. But I still think about it. The way the camera was quietly back in place like I'd never touched it. That short reply. The way it felt being in that room afterward, knowing someone might have been in there without me knowing. Since then, I haven't booked another Airbnb. I only stay in hotels now. Ones with front desks, security cameras in the halls, key cards that track entries. Maybe it's overkill. Maybe I'm just more cautious now. But that apartment in LA changed something in the way I travel. Because the worst part wasn't just the camera or the host's message. It was the realization that someone had crossed a line, and I would never know how far they went. I got into Seattle later than I planned. My flight had been delayed, the rental car line was long, and by the time I pulled up outside the Airbnb, it was already close to midnight. I was tired and just wanted to lay down. The place was a shared apartment, not ideal, but it was cheaper than a hotel. The host had sent me the code earlier in the evening, so I let myself in through the front door and stepped into a dim hallway with quiet, humming lights overhead. The building felt old. The wood floors creaked a little under my shoes. I kept my footsteps light as I walked through the narrow hall. There were framed photos on the wall, generic landscape stuff. The place smelled faintly of takeout and cleaning spray, like someone had rushed through with a mop and a microwave dinner. The room I had booked was supposed to be the third door on the left. I found it and keyed in the smaller 4-digit code the host had sent me for the door lock. The knob turned, and I pushed it open. The lights inside were already on. I froze. The bed was unmade. A dark green backpack was open on the floor beside it, with clothes spilling out. A pair of worn-looking sneakers were by the foot of the bed. There was a phone charger plugged into the wall and snaking onto the nightstand. Someone's jacket was hanging over the back of a chair near the small desk. A used toothbrush was sticking out of a plastic cup by the bathroom sink. And the bed. There were pillows arranged in a way that looked like someone had just gotten up. For a few seconds, I just stood there. I wasn't sure if maybe the cleaners hadn't come, or if someone had left their stuff by mistake. But this wasn't forgotten luggage. This looked like someone was living in here. Then I heard it, footsteps. From the hall. I stepped back out quickly and pulled the door shut. A man came down the hallway toward me. Mid-30s, skinny, wearing sweatpants and an old hoodie. He looked just as startled as I probably did. He stopped walking, stared at me, then looked at the door I had just closed. We didn't speak. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He just stood there and looked confused. I saw the moment it clicked for him. His face changed just slightly. Not angry, more like tired. Fed up. He shook his head a little and turned away. I stood there for a second longer, heart racing a bit, unsure what to do. I didn't want to knock. I didn't want to get into some weird confrontation in the middle of the night with a stranger in a shared apartment. I checked the message from the host again. She had definitely said that room was mine. But the guy in there clearly had been staying for more than a night. There was no way someone could have moved in like that in a few hours. I stepped outside and stood near my car for a while. The air was cold, even in June. I leaned against the driver's side door and tried to calm myself down. My phone buzzed with a notification from a news app. I turned it over so I wouldn't see the screen. Eventually, I messaged the host. No response. I called straight to voicemail. I didn't know if she was asleep or ignoring me, but either way, I wasn't going to stick around. I didn't trust that apartment anymore. I didn't feel safe walking back in there and hoping the situation would somehow fix itself. I thought about driving around to find a motel, but I was too tired, and everything nearby was either fully booked or sketchy looking. I didn't want to risk it. So I climbed into the back seat of my rental car. It wasn't comfortable. The seatbelt buckle dug into my side. I had to shove my suitcase into the front seat to stretch my legs. I took off my shoes and used my hoodie as a pillow. I cracked the windows slightly so I wouldn't wake up feeling like I was suffocating. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound outside made me open my eyes. A car drove by around 2 a.m. Someone slammed a door across the street around 3. I kept checking the time, hoping morning would come faster. Around 5:30, the sky started to brighten. My back hurt, my neck was stiff, and I was freezing. I turned on the car for some heat and sat there for a while, staring at the apartment building. Still no message from the host. Eventually, I drove to a nearby cafe that opened early. I washed my face in their bathroom and ordered a coffee and a breakfast sandwich. I must have looked awful, because the girl behind the counter gave me a concerned smile when she handed me my food. I sat in a corner booth and tried to figure out what to do next. I called Airbnb support. I explained everything. They said they'd look into it. It took a while, but eventually they refunded me and told me they'd investigate the listing. I found another Airbnb nearby, this time a full unit, not a shared place, and booked it for the rest of my stay. I didn't want to risk that kind of thing again. When I checked into the new place later that day, I was still shaken up. I kept the lights on for a while, double-checked every room, made sure no one was already inside. I never got a real explanation from the first host. She messaged back 2 days later with a generic apology, said it was a booking mix-up and that it sometimes happens. No offer to make things right. No real apology. A few days later, I went back to the listing out of curiosity. It was still up, still taking bookings. Same photos, same description, nothing changed. I left a review, as honest as I could make it without being angry. Just the facts. The room was already occupied. I had to sleep in my car. Be careful. That was the last time I ever booked a shared Airbnb. I don't care if it's cheaper or closer to downtown. It's not worth it. I still think about that night sometimes, how easily things could have gone worse. The man in the hallway hadn't been hostile, but if he had been, I would have been completely vulnerable, standing there alone in a strange building in a new city with no one around. I finished my trip, made it home safely, and went back to my normal routine. But I started checking and double-checking every detail on travel bookings after that. I don't take chances anymore. I don't assume the place will be safe just because it's listed online. And I always have a backup plan, because you never really know who else has a key. I booked a private room in a house just outside Eugene, Oregon. It was a last-minute trip. I wanted to get away for a few days, just me, my laptop, and a quiet place to think. I found a listing that seemed perfect. A private bedroom on the ground floor of a house, with its own bathroom. The host lived upstairs, but the photos showed a separate entrance through the back. It looked clean, well-lit, and the reviews were decent. I didn't think too much about it. I booked it for 3 nights. I got there around 5 in the evening. The house was older, maybe from the 70s, but it had been kept up well. The driveway curved slightly around to the back, where there was a small patio and the separate entrance for the ground floor. The host came out to meet me, tall guy, maybe mid-50s, polite but quiet. He handed me the key, gave a short tour of the space, and pointed out the light switches, the heater, and the Wi-Fi password stuck to the fridge. The room itself was bigger than I expected. A queen bed, a writing desk, and a little armchair by the window. The bathroom was just across the hall, private as listed. Everything smelled like pine sol and lemon air freshener. It was clean. Lived in, but clean. That first night was fine. I unpacked a little, then went out for dinner at a diner nearby. I got back around 9. It was already dark, and the yard was quiet. The motion sensor light flicked on as I approached the door, and I let myself in. I locked both the knob and the deadbolt behind me. The place was quiet enough to hear the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak from the ceiling above. It didn't bother me. Old houses always make noise. I went to bed a little before midnight. I turned off the hallway light, closed the bedroom door, and lay down. I had just started to doze off when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not above me, right outside the bedroom door. I froze. The sound was too clear, too close. It wasn't the floor settling. It was the creak of weight shifting on wood. Then nothing. I waited, heart pounding, staring up at the dark ceiling. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been the house shifting or maybe even a cat, though I hadn't seen one. I fell asleep eventually, sometime past 1. The next morning, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I'd been too tense from travel. I went for a walk in the nearby park, got some groceries, and spent most of the day reading and answering emails. It was quiet all day. I didn't hear the host, not even footsteps upstairs. That night, after dinner, I made sure the hallway light was off before I went to bed. I remember clearly flicking the switch near the bathroom and seeing the light go out. I closed the bedroom door, locked it. Thankfully, it had a simple turn lock, and got into bed. I woke up around 2 a.m., not sure why at first. The room was dark and quiet. Then I saw it, the faint yellow glow coming from under the door. The hallway light was on. I sat up and stared at the door for a long time. I hadn't turned that light on. I was sure of it. And then, like clockwork, I heard the slow, dragging footsteps again. Not hurried, just a few steps, then a pause, then another. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my door. I could see the shadow shift slightly under the crack, like someone adjusting their stance. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe a minute, maybe 10. Eventually, the shadow disappeared. The light stayed on. I stayed in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling until the sun started coming through the window. When I opened the door in the morning, the hallway light was still on. There was nothing out of place. No sign anyone had been there. The back door down the hall was locked. The stairs leading up to the main floor were shut behind a door, closed tight. I didn't hear the host all day. I thought about knocking, asking if he had come downstairs for something. But I didn't. I didn't even want to look at him. That whole day, I stayed in my room. I had food, water, my phone. I kept the door locked. I didn't nap. I didn't want to risk falling asleep and waking up in the middle of that again. That night, I stayed up late. I left the bedroom door open just a crack and kept the lamp on. I wanted to see if the hallway light would come on again. I was still dressed, sitting in the chair with my laptop, pretending to scroll through articles while my ears strained for any sound. Around 1:30, I heard a door creak. Not mine, the one upstairs. Then, footsteps on the stairs, slow, measured. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. The door to the stairs opened. I heard it, then the creak of footsteps on the ground floor. I stood up slowly, grabbed my phone, and stepped closer to the bedroom door. I looked down at the hallway floor. A shadow moved across the gap. I yanked the door open. No one was there, but the back door, the one I'd locked, was wide open. Cold air blew in from the yard. The curtains near the window fluttered slightly. I looked toward the stairwell. The door was shut, tight, like no one had ever opened it. I walked slowly to the back door, shut it, and locked both bolts again. Then I checked every lock, every window. Nothing broken, nothing out of place. I stood in the hallway, alone, heart racing. I didn't knock on the host's door. I didn't even want him to know I was awake. I locked myself in my room, shoved the small armchair in front of the door, and stayed in bed with my phone flashlight on. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sun to rise. At 6 a.m., I packed. I didn't shower. I didn't eat. I shoved everything into my backpack and walked straight out. I didn't even look back at the house. I drove to a Starbucks 20 minutes away, sat in the parking lot, and reported the incident to Airbnb. I told them what happened. The lights turning on, the footsteps, the shadow, the unlocked door. They offered me a refund for the final night and said they'd follow up with the host. I don't know what he was doing. I don't know if he was coming downstairs to watch me sleep or if he just liked messing with guests. I don't care. I left and never looked back. I've stayed in dozens of Airbnbs over the years. That's the only one I ever walked out of early. I still think about the way those footsteps sounded. Slow, heavy, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them, or maybe wanted me to. My friend and I had planned the trip a few weeks in advance. We both needed a break from work, and we figured a long weekend in Chicago would be perfect. We wanted to be close enough to the downtown area to get around easily, but didn't want to pay ridiculous hotel prices. So we looked at Airbnb listings trying to find something affordable, but not too sketchy. The one we chose was in an older part of the city, west of downtown. The pictures looked decent. An older brick building, second-floor unit, recently renovated. It had a small kitchen, a couple of couches, and one bedroom with 2 beds. Nothing fancy, but clean and affordable. The reviews weren't glowing, but nothing raised red flags. A few people mentioned creaky floors or drafty windows, but that was about it. We arrived in the late afternoon. The neighborhood looked worn, but not unsafe. The buildings had that classic Chicago look, tall, narrow, with rusted fire escapes zigzagging down the sides. The unit was on the second floor. We entered using the keypad the host had sent us. The hallway inside the building was dimly lit and smelled a little like mildew, but again, nothing too alarming. Inside the unit, the place was exactly as described. The wood floors creaked when we walked, the couch sagged in the middle, and the kitchen had that artificial lemon scent that covers up old smells. But everything seemed functional. We dropped our bags and decided to grab dinner before unpacking. After we got back that night, I took a quick shower. The bathroom was small, but the tile was clean and the water pressure was fine. The mirror above the sink was one of those big rectangular ones that covered most of the wall. I noticed it looked a little off, not dirty, just something about it didn't sit right with me. The glass was clear, but there was a slight haze at the edges, like the silvering behind it was wearing off. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I tapped it with my knuckle. Instead of a dull, solid sound like I expected, it echoed slightly. Hollow. I tapped again, harder. It wasn't loud, but I felt something strange in my gut, like a shift. My friend asked what I was doing. I told him something felt off about the mirror. He shrugged, probably thinking I was being paranoid. I left it alone that night, but the thought stuck with me. The next morning, I went back to it in better light. I ran my fingers along the edges. It didn't sit flush against the wall. There was a small gap near the bottom right corner, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. I pushed a little. It didn't budge. My friend was still half asleep, but I asked him to help me check it out. We found a butter knife in one of the kitchen drawers and carefully wedged it into the gap. It didn't take much. After a little prying, the mirror came forward, swinging slightly like a door. It wasn't bolted down, it was mounted on a hinge that let it open inward, like a cupboard. Behind it was a dark, narrow cavity about a foot deep. At first, it looked like just an unfinished part of the wall, like the kind of space you'd leave behind drywall during remodeling. But there was a hole, roughly 5 inches wide, cut through the back of the cavity, directly facing the shower. It wasn't a crack or some plumbing opening. It was cleanly cut, circular, like someone had used a hole saw or a drill attachment. We stared at it in silence for a few seconds. I could feel my skin crawling. I leaned in to look closer. The hole went clean through the wall. On the other side was complete darkness, but I could tell it led somewhere, another room, or maybe another crawl space. I couldn't see through it clearly, but I didn't need to. The angle was perfect. Anyone on the other side would have had a direct view of the shower. There was dust inside the cavity, but not much. The edges of the hole were smooth, too smooth to be old. My stomach turned. I backed away and just stood there, trying to process it. We didn't say much to each other. We packed up our stuff in maybe 10 minutes, barely speaking. My hands were shaking while I zipped up my bag. I kept thinking about that mirror, how many people had stayed here before, how many hadn't noticed, whether we were being watched the night before. I didn't want to check for cameras. I didn't want to know. As we were leaving, I looked at the bathroom door one last time and felt a tight, cold weight settle in my chest. The idea that someone had designed that setup intentionally, cut that hole, mounted the mirror, and left it there for who knows how long, it made my skin crawl in a way I hadn't felt before. It wasn't some broken down old property with a few quirks. Someone had done that on purpose. We got into the car and drove without saying a word for the first 15 minutes. We didn't even stop for coffee. I waited until we were well away from the place before reporting it through the Airbnb app. I didn't want to call the host.
I didn't want to talk to them.
I wrote a detailed report, described everything, sent photos of the mirror off the wall, and attached the picture I took of the hole. Airbnb responded quickly, much faster than I expected. They refunded us fully within a couple of hours. That should have been the end of it. But a few days later, I checked the listing again. It was still there. Same pictures. Same description. Nothing had changed. I reported it again, even more bluntly this time, and flagged it as a safety issue. Still, the listing stayed up for another week before it disappeared. I don't know if Airbnb finally shut it down or if the host just deactivated it temporarily to make changes. I kept wondering who else had stayed there, how many people showered in that bathroom without ever realizing someone might be watching. And I kept thinking how if I had knocked on the mirror out of pure curiosity, we might have never known. Maybe that's what disturbed me the most, how easy it would have been to miss it. I haven't used Airbnb since. Hotels might cost more, but at least you know who's responsible if something goes wrong. When you stay in a stranger's house, you don't really know what you're walking into. You're trusting that the person on the other end is just looking to make a little extra money, not something worse. That trip was supposed to be a break, a chance to relax. But it ended with me questioning how easily someone could invade your privacy, hide behind walls, and watch without you ever knowing. That mirror, that hole, I still think about it sometimes. The way it was all hidden in plain sight. How long it had been there. And most of all, who had been on the other side. I booked the Airbnb for a quick trip to Denver. It was a last-minute thing. I was there for 2 nights to meet a potential client and scout a location for a small project. Hotels were either overpriced or booked solid, so I found this basement apartment just outside the city center. The listing said it was a private unit with its own entrance, clean, quiet, and ideal for solo travelers. The reviews were mostly positive. A few mentioned the place being a little dark, but otherwise fine. I didn't think much of it. I checked in around 6 p.m. The host left a code for a lockbox beside the door, and the key was inside. The apartment was exactly what I expected: small, plain, and kind of cold, but clean enough. It was a basement unit, so the windows were those narrow, rectangular types right at ground level. Not much natural light, and the ceiling was low, but I only needed a place to sleep and shower. It had a small kitchenette, a bathroom with a standing shower, a little couch, and a bed tucked into a corner. The furniture was mismatched, and the decor was random. Old framed movie posters, a dusty fake plant, a broken lamp that didn't turn on. It smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, and the air felt damp, like the place hadn't been aired out in a while. Still, nothing that made me uncomfortable. I made a quick dinner, answered a few emails, and got into bed a little before midnight. I'm usually a light sleeper in new places, but that night I must have knocked out hard because I don't remember tossing or turning at all until I woke up around 3 a.m. I felt the pressure in my bladder and realized I needed to use the bathroom. I got up and padded across the tile floor in my socks. The bathroom light was bright, and I squinted against it while I washed my hands. As I walked back toward the bed, something caught my eye: the front door. It was cracked open, just a little, maybe 3 or 4 inches, enough to see the edge of the dark hallway outside. I stopped cold. I was sure I had locked it. Not just closed it, I'd turned the deadbolt myself when I came in. I always do that, especially when I'm staying somewhere unfamiliar. I remember even pulling on the handle to check. I stared at the open door for a few seconds, my heart suddenly pounding. I couldn't hear anything outside.
No footsteps, no voices.
Just silence. I walked over slowly and pushed the door shut. Then I turned the deadbolt again and locked the knob for good measure. I stood there for a minute with my hand still on the doorknob, listening. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator. I went back to bed, but I didn't fall asleep right away.
I kept thinking about it.
Maybe I hadn't locked it properly. Maybe I thought I had, but the latch didn't catch. I tried to convince myself it was just my mistake, but I had that uneasy feeling in my chest, like something wasn't right. Eventually, I drifted off again, but I woke up early. Around 7:30, I got out of bed and went to the kitchen to make some coffee. That's when I saw the footprints. The floor from the entryway to the kitchenette was tile, off-white, with some gray marbling. Easy to clean, but also easy to spot dirt on. There were muddy footprints leading from the door, across the room, and into the middle of the floor. They weren't mine. I had taken my shoes off by the door when I arrived, and I hadn't gone outside since. My sneakers were still sitting right where I left them, clean. I checked the bottom of my socks. Nothing. The prints were partial, but you could see enough to tell they were made by someone walking in with wet or dirty shoes. The heel and toe of each step were clear, like someone had come in, taken a few steps, and then either stopped or turned around. They didn't lead to the couch or the bed. Just into the middle of the room, then gone. It wasn't raining the night before, but it had drizzled earlier that day, and the ground was still wet when I arrived. I crouched down and looked more closely. The prints had started to dry, but the edges were still dark. Whoever had made them had come in sometime in the night. After I went to sleep, after I locked the door, my stomach dropped. I got up, went to the door, and checked it again. It was still locked, deadbolt, knob, everything. There were no signs of forced entry. No scratches on the frame, nothing broken. I looked at the windows. Too small for anyone to crawl through. I was trying to stay calm, but my hands were starting to shake. I grabbed my phone and opened the Airbnb app. There was a contact host button. I sent a message, asking if anyone else had access to the apartment. I kept it simple. Just wanted to know if she'd given out an extra key to a cleaner or a maintenance person. About 20 minutes later, she replied. The message was short. She said no one else should have been in the unit, but then added that her ex still had a copy of the key and she'd been meaning to change the locks. That's exactly how she wrote it. Like it was no big deal. Like I hadn't just woken up to find the front door open and muddy footprints inside. I didn't respond. I didn't wait. I started packing immediately. I threw everything back into my bag, my laptop, clothes, chargers, toiletries, and got out of there within 10 minutes. I didn't even bother eating. I just needed to be out of that place. I drove to a Starbucks about 15 minutes away and sat in the parking lot for almost an hour. I kept looking around, checking mirrors, watching the people going in and out of the store. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. How close someone had been while I was asleep. How they might have stood there in the middle of the room, watching, thinking. Maybe they changed their mind. Maybe they didn't find what they were looking for. Maybe they were waiting for something. I reported it to Airbnb, told them everything. I sent them photos of the footprints, screenshots of the host's messages, even timestamps from my phone showing I was inside all night. They apologized, said they'd look into it, and gave me a refund for the remaining night. I booked a hotel for the second night, one with a lobby and cameras and a front desk. I didn't sleep much the rest of the trip. Even in the hotel, I kept checking the door, waking up at every noise in the hallway. That feeling stayed with me for days after I got back home. The unease. The way the hair stood up on my arms when I remembered standing in that room, looking at those prints. I still don't know who it was. The host never followed up, and I didn't ask. I left a review, vague but honest. Just said I had a safety concern and wouldn't recommend staying alone. That was the last time I booked a basement unit. I rented a small cottage in Northern California through Airbnb for a quiet getaway. I'd been burnt out for months, work, life, everything felt loud, so I picked this place because it was remote. Really remote. The listing said it was on the edge of a private property line, surrounded by woods. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, no neighbors for miles. It looked older, but the reviews were solid. People mentioned how peaceful it was, how disconnected they felt, which is exactly what I needed. I booked it for 5 nights. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive had been long, winding uphill through tree-lined roads until the GPS signal dropped completely. Luckily, the host had emailed detailed directions. I followed them through a narrow dirt road that opened into a small clearing. The cottage sat there alone, shaded by tall pines, with a gravel drive in front and a wooden deck that wrapped halfway around the house. It was quiet. No cars. No distant highway hum. Just the sound of birds and wind in the trees. Inside, the place was small but cozy. Wood paneling everywhere, old furniture, mismatched dishes in the cabinets. It had that slightly musty smell that old homes get, but it wasn't bad, just noticeable. The Wi-Fi barely worked, and I didn't have any cell signal. I didn't mind. That was part of the plan. The first night was uneventful. I read for a while, made dinner, had a drink on the deck while the sky faded to black. I hadn't seen a single person since arriving. I slept surprisingly well for being in a strange place. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I was lying in bed around 11 p.m., the room completely dark except for a bit of moonlight coming through the curtain. I had just started to drift off when I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to snap me awake. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal outside, raccoons, or maybe even deer. The place backed up to thick woods, and the host had mentioned that wildlife was common. But then I heard it again. Knocking. Not from the front door, not from a wall. It was coming from below me. A soft, steady thudding 3 or 4 knocks, then silence. Then again. I sat up in bed, heart already pounding. I turned on the lamp and listened. The knocking stopped. The floor was old wood, and I felt every creak and shift of the house. I sat completely still for a few minutes. Nothing. I got up, checked the front door. It was locked. I peeked through the windows. Darkness outside. No movement. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small sound felt like something. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the house. I figured maybe a branch had fallen, or an animal had gotten under the cottage. There was a small crawl space hatch around the back, low to the ground. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived. It was metal, with a simple latch, and sat against the concrete foundation. I stopped when I got closer. There were marks on the dirt near the hatch. Drag marks. The soil wasn't soft, but it had rained lightly the day before. and the ground still held the impression. It looked like something heavy had been pulled toward the hatch, like two long, shallow grooves, with a disturbed patch near the entrance. I squatted down and saw that the latch on the hatch door was dusty, but clean in one spot, like it had been handled recently. I didn't open it. I don't know why exactly. Something about it just felt wrong. I stared at it for a while, then stood up and walked back inside. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe the last guest had been poking around and left the marks. But the knocking that had felt deliberate. It hadn't sounded like scratching or scurrying. It sounded like a fist. That afternoon, I packed up my things. I still had 2 nights left, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the floor, listening, feeling like I was being watched even though I knew that was irrational. I didn't hear any more knocking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been under the house. When I left, I didn't tell the host anything. I just messaged and said something had come up and I had to leave early. They responded politely. I drove back the same winding road, this time more alert, watching the tree line, checking my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station with a cell signal hours later. I kept thinking about that crawl space. For days afterward, I tried to forget about it. I told myself I'd imagined the knocking, that the drag marks were old, that nothing was down there. But that feeling stayed with me, like an itch I couldn't reach. 2 weeks later, I saw the news article. I wasn't even looking for it. I was just scrolling through headlines when one caught my eye. Asterisk, man found living in crawl space of remote Northern California home. Asterisk, I clicked it instantly. The article said that a couple had returned to their cabin after being gone for several weeks. They noticed food missing, tools moved, weird smells. When they investigated, they found someone had been living under their house, in the crawl space. A man in his 40s, dirty, malnourished, armed with a knife. Police said he'd been hiding there for days, possibly longer. He had bedding, canned food, even a battery-powered lantern under there. They didn't say exactly where it was, just that it was in the same county where I'd stayed. There was no picture of the house, no street name, no Airbnb listing link. I tried to figure out if it was the same place, but I couldn't be sure. Still, my stomach dropped when I read it. I kept thinking about the hatch, the knocking, the drag marks in the dirt. I kept wondering if the man had already been there when I was, or if he came after. Or worse, what if he'd been watching me? What if the knocking was intentional? I haven't booked a remote place since then. I still travel, but I stay in hotels now. Big ones, with people around, security cameras, staff. I think about that cottage sometimes, that quiet little house in the woods. It looked so peaceful. But now, every time I picture it, I think about the crawl space. I think about that sound beneath the floor. And I think about how close I came to opening that hatch. I booked the place because I wanted some quiet. It was a weekend off from work, and I didn't want to be around people or noise. The Airbnb listing was for a large house about 30 minutes outside Austin, kind of tucked away on the edge of a wooded area. It looked modern and clean in the photos, lots of open space, big windows, sleek kitchen, a long hallway that stretched toward the back of the house. It seemed perfect. The host had really good reviews, nothing weird or sketchy. The price was decent for the size, probably because it wasn't close to anything. That's what I liked. I brought some groceries with me and planned to spend most of the weekend reading, cooking, maybe going for a short hike if I felt like it. Just wanted to unplug. When I got there Friday afternoon, everything looked exactly like the pictures. The key was in a little lockbox by the front door. Inside, it smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The house was spotless, almost too spotless. All the furniture looked like it had barely been used. There were fresh towels folded on the bathroom counter, labeled with little cards, like in hotels. The fridge was empty, but spotless, no smells. All the drawers in the kitchen were organized like someone had gone through them with a ruler. Everything lined up, but I didn't think much of it at the time. At the end of the hallway, past the bedrooms and guest bathroom, there was a heavy wooden door that didn't match the rest of the house. All the other doors were flat, white, minimal. This one was older, dark wood, almost like it had been taken from another house entirely. It had a silver knob and a padlock through a latch near the top. I remembered the listing saying something about a locked storage room that guests weren't allowed to enter. I assumed it was where the host kept extra supplies or personal items. I didn't care. I wasn't planning on snooping. The first night was completely normal. I made some pasta, watched something dumb on my laptop, read a bit. I was in bed by 11. The house creaked occasionally, but that's just what houses do. I didn't hear anything strange.
Slept fine.
The second night was different. It started around 2:30 in the morning. I wasn't fully awake. I was in that hazy, half-dreaming state when your brain's still foggy. But then I heard it. A thump, then a dragging sound. Long, like something heavy being moved slowly across the floor. I opened my eyes and listened. The house was quiet again for a second, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then another thump. Same direction. From the end of the hallway. I sat up in bed. It was completely dark, no streetlights outside, just the pale green glow of the smoke detector on the ceiling. I sat there listening, trying to figure out if it was pipes or maybe the wind. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded like something or someone was moving inside that locked room. I got up and walked to the hallway, barefoot, not turning on any lights. My heart was already picking up. It was stupid, I told myself. Probably just something shifting behind the walls. Maybe a rodent. Maybe nothing. The hallway was long and narrow, carpeted. At the far end, the wooden door looked even darker in the low light, almost like it absorbed whatever moonlight was filtering in through the living room windows. I walked down slowly. When I got close to the door, I stopped and listened again. For a few seconds, I didn't hear anything, but then something moved. A soft scuffle, like bare feet on a hard floor, followed by another slow dragging sound. It was coming from inside the room. I just stood there, frozen. I stared at the door, at the old padlock holding it shut. I don't know why I did it, but I knocked. Lightly. Just 3 knocks, quick. Whatever was happening inside went completely silent. I waited for a full minute.
No sounds.
Not a creak, not a whisper. I backed up slowly, went to the kitchen, and stood there with my arms crossed, trying to decide if I should call someone or just leave. But it was late, and I couldn't prove anything. The door was still locked. There was no way someone was in there, right? I walked back to my room, locked the bedroom door, and lay awake until morning. I finally fell asleep around dawn. When I woke up, the sun was already up and pouring through the windows. For a second, I questioned if I had dreamed at all. It felt like a blur. But when I got up and walked back to the end of the hallway, everything changed. The door looked the same, still padlocked. But when I got close, I noticed the scratches. Long, thin gouges along the inside edge of the door, near the frame. Not from the outside. From the inside. Deep ones. Some looked like fingernails. Others looked like they'd been made with something sharper. They ran vertically and diagonally, some overlapping like whoever or whatever was inside had been clawing at the door, trying to get out. I didn't touch it. I didn't even take a photo. I just stood there for a few seconds, staring. I could feel it then. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. I could smell something faint, too. Something sour, like sweat and mildew, leaking out through the cracks. I packed in under 10 minutes. Tossed all my stuff into my duffel. Didn't bother folding anything. I didn't even brush my teeth. I left the key on the counter and walked out without looking back. As I stepped outside, the fresh air hit me like a wave. The house had started to feel like a trap. I drove straight back to Austin, didn't stop until I hit the city limits. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't message the host. I didn't report anything to Airbnb. I didn't want to deal with follow-ups or questions. I just left a basic review a week later. Nice place, quiet, clean. Would recommend. I've thought about it a lot since then. I even went back to the listing once out of curiosity, but it was gone. Either taken down or renamed. The photos weren't saved on my browser. Nothing. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that dragging sound in my head. I wonder what or who was inside that room. I wonder how long they had been trying to get out. And I wonder what would have happened if that lock had ever failed.